Hello and welcome to another lecture for my class, Psychological Aspects of Drug Use and Abuse. I'd like to kick off this lecture by asking a question which may seem provocative or it may just seem kind of silly. And that question is, are drugs a problem? And in one way or the other, I think we've probably all encountered this question in classes that we've taken or public service announcements that we've seen on television or online, or even in conversations that we've had with friends and family members about drugs. And the way in which the question is maybe a little bit silly is that, of course, drugs aren't a problem. You know, any drug, whether it's heroin or marijuana or alcohol or nicotine in cigarettes, by themselves, sitting on a table, do no harm to no one, or at least very little harm to anyone. Drug use, on the other hand, may be a problem because drug use by people can be associated, as we've discussed a little bit before, with both benefits and risks. And in order to answer the question, are drugs a problem, or maybe more precisely, is drug use a problem, we have to address that balance. What is the right balance between the risks and the rewards or the benefits that are associated with various drugs? So in the next few slides in this particular lecture and in the subsequent lectures, what I'd like to do is address the different ways in which we make judgments about the risks associated with drugs. Now, we'll talk about some of the benefits of drugs later on in the semester when I talk about individual drugs like marijuana, like alcohol, like nicotine. For the next few lectures, we're going to really focus on the risks and focus on the different ways in which we can evaluate or we can assess the risks associated with drug use generally or with specific use of specific drugs. And for the purposes of this lecture or this discussion, I want to highlight three basic ways that we can think about risks or problems associated with drug use. And the first of these is toxicity. That is, we can make a judgment about how dangerous a drug is or how dangerous use of a drug is as a function of how damaging that drug can be to the physical or mental health of the people who use it. A drug which is very toxic reasonably is more risky or dangerous than a drug which is not particularly toxic. Of course, it's not just about toxicity. There's another criterion that we can use in evaluating the riskiness of drug use, and that is the criterion related to addiction. Now, in the previous lectures, I've talked a little bit about drug dependence as it is formally diagnosed. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a coming lecture. But obviously, we all have some idea of what addiction is, and clearly, a drug which has a high risk for addiction or is likely to lead to addiction if it's used, it can be judged as being more risky than a drug which has a very low likelihood of leading to addiction. Because for most drugs and for most people, addiction is probably not a good thing. There may be drugs which are fairly addictive but fairly benign to health. For instance, at this very moment, I'm drinking some coffee and I'm thus indulging in the use of caffeine. That's a drug which is fairly addictive and not particularly toxic to the body. So there may be cases in which addictive drugs are not risky, but for most people, if you ask them, would you like to use a drug that you could get hooked on? Most of those folks would be at least a little bit reluctant as compared to asking them, would you like to use a drug which you have very little likelihood of getting addicted to? So again, toxicity is one way of thinking about risk. Addiction or risk or proneness to addiction is another. And a third criterion or a third way of thinking about the riskiness of a drug is the extent to which drug use or use of that particular drug or use of drugs in general is associated with social problems. I'm really going to focus on problems like crime and especially violence. Now, there are other problems that we could talk about, but there are only so many minutes that I can cram into each of these lectures. I'm going to focus on those particular problems. That's a tricky criterion to use because, of course, some of the problems associated with drug use are a function of the drug use itself. The extent to which a drug might encourage people to behave violently, for instance. And some of the social problems associated with drug use are a function of the laws which exist around those drugs. And changes in laws might very well lead to changes in some of the social problems associated with drug use. So I know I'm giving a lot of information now. Just try and keep clear that for the purpose of my lecture, there are three basic criteria or three basic ways that we can use for thinking about the risks associated with drug use. I'm going to explore each of these in the coming slides of this lecture and in the subsequent lectures within this set or series. And to be clear, today I'm really focusing on toxicity. How do we think about the toxicity of drugs? And at the risk of making things sound more complicated, we can think about different ways of measuring toxicity. There are approaches to measuring toxicity in laboratory studies that are worth talking about. There are approaches that have to do with judging how toxic drugs appear to be in the field, meaning out in the real world as people use them in their day-to-day lives. And we can also make a distinction between the acute and the chronic toxicity associated with the use of a particular drug. So how dangerous is that drug to you in the short run? What's its acute toxicity? And how dangerous is drug use or use of a particular drug in the long run? What's its chronic toxicity? So we're focusing on toxicity in this lecture, and we're thinking about some of the ways in which we can evaluate or even measure toxicity. Alright, so let's go. Toxicity. Here's a scary skull and crossbones, and if you didn't need the warning, now you have it. When we talk about toxicity, we're talking about the extent to which use of a drug is poisonous or dangerous or even deadly. To what extent is the use of a given drug going to lead to damage or even the destruction of the organ systems in your body, maybe even up to the point of death? Now, as I suggested earlier, there are different ways to measure toxicity, and I'm really going to try and highlight two. To keep things kind of simple, I'm going to focus on two broad ways of evaluating toxicity. The first of these ways is using experimental approaches to research, experimental studies, most of which, for our purposes, are going to be laboratory studies with animals, or more rarely with people. So you can try to evaluate how toxic a drug is by studying the effects that it has on organ systems in laboratory settings for animals, or more rarely for people. Obviously, a lot of experimental drug work that we do is with animals, non-human animals that is, for ethical and safety reasons. Now, another way to think about toxicity, or to try to measure it, is to go out into the real world, go out into the field, as we sometimes say, and conduct non-experimental studies where we look at the correlation between use of a particular drug and problems that occur for people who use that drug out in their day-to-day lives. So to what extent does the use of a given drug lead people to end up in clinics or hospitals, in emergency rooms, seeking treatment for drug problems, or even ending up arrested for drug problems? What are the relationships or the correlations between use of a drug and physical and mental health problems associated with use of a drug? How can we see those relationships non-experimentally out in the real world? And it's not that one approach is better and one approach is worse. Ideally, I suppose there's kind of like a yin and yang relationship where each approach to thinking about or measuring toxicity can be informing and reinforcing of the other. Okay, let's focus first on the measuring of toxicity in the laboratory. And we can ask a question that may seem sort of obvious or even sort of silly, and that question is, what makes a drug toxic? And at a very basic level, what makes a drug toxic is the amount that is used. Almost any substance, including substances which we consider benign or even salubrious, like water, can be dangerous if you take too much of it. Drink a little bit of water, fine. You drink enough water for your body's needs, great, that's healthy. If you drink an awful lot of water, if you binge on water, which occasionally people with eating disorders or other psychological problems will do, you can actually kill yourself. Your body can lose proper electrolyte balance, and your heart can become arrhythmic, and you can have neurological problems. So, crazy as that might sound, things which, what makes something deadly or makes something safe often has a lot to do with how much of it you use. Another example might be something like caffeine. I'm drinking coffee right now. Now, caffeine across a broad range of doses is fairly benign. That is to say, not particularly dangerous to people who are otherwise healthy. But you can, if you really try, take in enough caffeine to hurt yourself. It would be difficult to do because you'd have to use purified, crystallized caffeine. It'd be hard to drink enough coffee to really do yourself a lot of damage, but you could, at least in principle. So one thing to think about when thinking about the measurement of toxicity, especially in laboratory settings, is the amount that is being given. And people who study dose effects of drugs will often create what are called dose effect curves, and you can see a picture of one right here. A dose effect curve is just very simply a graphical representation of the relationship between the amount of drug that is given, that is the dose. Are you giving people relatively little, or are you giving people relatively more, and the amount of effect that is associated with a drug. Now that effect can be a good effect, like something you want the drug to do, how effective it is for treating a particular illness or whatever, or that drug can be a bad effect, like a toxic damage to the body. Oftentimes when we look at dose effect curves, we see this kind of sideways lazy S sort of sigmoid curve. Sometimes when we look at dose effect curves, we see an inverted U. This is sometimes called a biphasic dose effect curve. Biphasic just meaning two phases or two effects. You can see for this kind of sort of a drug example here, as you go from a relatively low dose to a sort of a moderate dose, the effect of it goes up, but then at some point you exceed a tipping threshold, and then the effect goes down. So different drugs will have different dose effect curves, indeed, depending on the type of effect you're looking at. But the basic idea to take away right now is you can plot on a graph, or you can represent in a table of numbers, the relationship between how much of a drug is given and how strong a given effect of that drug is on average in a group of people who are taking the drug. Now with that in mind, people who study, especially in laboratory settings, drug effects, people who are pharmacologists, will often talk about aspects of a dose effect curve. Now one aspect of a dose effect curve is the efficacy level, that is the peak of that dose response or dose effect curve. So how strong is the strongest possible effect that you can get from a drug? What's the measured efficacy of the drug? A related idea is what is the potency of the drug? That's what's the minimum amount of dose you can get to achieve efficacy. I have a picture of marijuana here. As you of course know, and as I've discussed in previous lectures, there is some research, there's a lot of commercial interest and a lot of just frankly sort of public discussion about medical marijuana, the use of marijuana to treat various medical conditions, including side effects of other drugs which are given for different medical conditions. A lot of the challenge to medicalizing marijuana is understanding the efficacy and the potency of different strains of marijuana for treatment of different problems. Not that can't be done, but it's certainly challenging. How much marijuana do you have to smoke at a minimum to get a potent effect for treating nausea, let's say? Or what is the maximum amount of effect, the efficacy at its highest level that marijuana can give you for, let's say, blocking pain if you have a severe spinal injury? So plotting different dose effect curves and thinking about potency and efficacy and other aspects of a dose response curve, that's complicated stuff, and there are people right now trying to work some of that stuff out. To move on a little bit, here's just another kind of sort of fake dose effect curve for two drugs. You can see there's drug A in the blue line, drug B in the green line, and you can see that when you have dose effect curves, if you have two drugs and you're looking at the same effect that each drug has, let's say both A and B are painkillers, you can compare the two drugs in terms of their different dose effect curves. So you can see here that the at a maximum efficacy, both drug B and drug A both drug A and drug B have about the same maximal efficacy. Like at their highest possible level of effect, both of them are about equally effective, at whatever it is that we're measuring. Again, let's imagine we're measuring blocking pain. These are maybe 2 opioid analgesics that are given to people with severe injuries, and at their highest doses, each of them is about as good as the other for the maximum level of pain blocking that they're going to give on average for people who take them. But you can see here that these two drugs are different in terms of their potency. Drug A in blue has a higher level of effect earlier on than drug B. If you're sort of walking your eyes along the x-axis of this graph and then kind of glancing upwards at the relative height of the blue line and the green line, you can see that for the most of the graph, the blue line, which is drug A, is higher than the green line, drug B, suggesting that you get more bang for the buck, if you will, if you're giving drug A as compared to drug B. So again, if you were a pharmacologist looking at the relative dose response efficacy, or I should say potency, of these two drugs, you might say, well, at a maximum dose they're both about the same, but if you wanted to get a stronger effect at a lower dose, you might want to choose drug A over drug B. So basic kind of comparisons that we can make. Now, important point to move on here, or a couple important points to move on. Oh, I'm sorry, this forgot my little caption there. This is just dose effect curve for two drugs, as you obviously know now. But as I was saying, an important point to move is that people respond differently to drugs. So these dose effect curves that I'm talking about here are just averages based on real or simulated dosing for large groups of people. People are going to respond differently to drugs. Some people get a stronger effect earlier for a drug, other people are more tolerant to the drug and get a weaker effect later on, etc., etc. And with this in mind, pharmacologists and people who are just interested in pharmacology, people like me, can talk about things like the effective dose and the lethal dose of a drug. And here we're using the same idea of a dose effect curve or dose response curve, and we're plotting the percentage of people that we would estimate within a given population who will have a given level of effect or a given level of lethality at a particular dose. So for a drug, mysterious new drug, drug X, at a given dose, 50 milligrams of drug X, what percentage of the people who take a 50 milligram dose will have a given level of effect, if it's pain blocking or I don't know, whatever else, and what percentage of people at that same dose will actually die from the dose, will overdose at that level? So here is the effective dose curve and the lethal dose curve, respectively ED and LD, for two different drugs. And you could, I'm sorry, for one drug. And you can imagine that this drug is some sort of a sedative. It's a drug to calm people down or maybe even put them to sleep, like a sleeping pill. And you can see here for the blue line, as you walk from a relatively low dose to a relatively higher dose, you hit some mile points or some markers on your x-axis. So we're looking at the x-axis underneath the blue curve, and you can see at a very low level there's almost no effect. So no one who receives a very low dose of the drug, or a very low percentage of people who receive a low dose of the drug have any effect. Maybe a few, a small percent. You can see ED2. And so whatever point lies at ED2, that's where 2% of the people in a population on average will have an effect from the drug. You walk along the x-axis, you get to ED50. That's the dose at which we'd expect about 50% of the people in a population who are given that dose would have the effect desired from that drug. So again, the drug's a sedative, and if you give them whatever ED50 corresponds to, 100 milligrams, 120 milligrams, whatever, that's the dose at which about half of the people who get that dose will have the effect. They'll feel sedated. The other half of the people, they won't have the effect yet. If you keep on adding higher and higher doses, of course the dose curve goes up, 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 and eventually at some point you have ED95 or indeed ED100, doses at which just about everyone who gets that level of dose will have the targeted effect. So you can imagine if you're a pharmacologist and you're developing a new drug and you're trying to work out how much should we give people. I mean, indeed, like if you take aspirin or Tylenol or any medication, whether it's over the counter or prescription, if you look on the back and you read those instructions, you look at the little active ingredient information, 50 milligrams of acetaminophen or whatever, you might ask yourself, how do they work out that you're supposed to take 2 pills instead of 1? Or 3 pills every 2 hours or whatever. It's basically this process of either developing or simulating populations of people and then graphing how much of a dose do you need to give such that most people who get that dose will get the desired effect. That's the effective dosing curve type analysis that you could do. The challenge there is that you also, if you're a pharmacologist, have to be mindful of the fact that all drugs will be lethal, or pretty much all drugs will be lethal if you give folks enough of them. So as you're increasing the dose of a given drug, you're increasing the percentage of people who will get the desired effect. The ED line is rising, but also the LD, the lethal dose line, is rising. So you could imagine, we're giving more and more of our drug because we're studying it. We're trying to figure out how much is the optimal dose for most people. We have to be careful because the more drug we're adding, the greater the likelihood that a large percentage of the population will die from that drug. So now we're looking at the LD curve, that's the green line, and we could imagine we're walking along the line, walking along the x-axis, the area under that green curve, and you can see that somewhere at about a little bit to the right of where ED 95 is, there's some point at which we could write ED 100, a dose at which 100% of the people get the desired effect. But that level, or that line, or that point I should say, would lie beneath the green line for the lethal dose. So we could get a dose high enough that 100% of the people get the effect, but at that point some of the people who got that high dose would be expected to die from it. And indeed, if we kept on giving higher and higher doses carelessly, we'd expect more and more people to die. So at a very high dose, we hit LD 50. That's the dose level at which 50% of the people who take that dose, we would expect to die from it. And indeed, if we kept on cranking up the dose like some sort of evil scientist or evil pharmacologist, we could find a dose at which we'd expect 100% of the people who got that dose of drug in the population would die from it. Okay, so effective dose curve, lethal dose curve, these two things go together. They're inextricably linked. And an interesting idea, or an important idea to think about is, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. Well, I'll say it right now. An interesting idea to think about is the relative margin of safety. That is, how near or how far those two curves are from each other. I'll talk about that in just a second, but here's just another example. We can see a drug where there's an effective dose curve and a lethal dose curve, and you can see that there's an overlap of those two curves such that if you wanted to give a 50 milligram dose of this sleep-inducing drug, this sort of sedative or tranquilizer, you could give at 50 milligrams a dose at which 100% of the people would fall asleep, but maybe upwards of 10 or 12% of people who got 50 milligrams would die. So that wouldn't be good. You might imagine as a pharmacologist backing off that dose and saying, well, we'll give a lower dose, recognizing that that won't work for everyone, but recognizing that it will be safe for everyone. So again, as a pharmacologist, you would be thinking about what's the optimal dose where we get the most bang for our buck without inducing a lot of toxic risk, especially lethal toxic risk. And again, I got a little bit ahead of myself. I get excited about pharmacology, I guess. I got a little bit ahead of myself a moment ago, but this distance between the effective dose curve and the lethal dose curve, generally speaking, is called the margin of safety. And basically, the farther away those curves are, the more that the lethal dose curve is shifted further right from the effective dose curve, the safer the drug is. And indeed, if you want to move beyond that general definition, there's a more specific definition that hardcore pharmacology people would use, wherein margin of safety would be defined as lethal dose 1 divided by effective dose 99. That is, what's the ratio at which 99% of the population gets the the desired effect, and only about 1% of the population dies from the drug. And clearly, the bigger that ratio is, the safer the drug is, the wider that margin is. Drugs which have very low margins of safety are tricky to use because in an effort to give people enough drug to have the desired effect, you can easily overshoot and start giving people drugs a level of dose which is dangerous for folks. So I've been kind of talking on and on right now. Let's pause and let's you think about this. Here's an example. I want you to practice judging the toxicity of drugs based on their effective and lethal dosing curves. So here's drug A, and here's drug B. And in case it's not obvious to you, the blue line here is the effective dose curve, and the red line here is the lethal dose curve. So think about drug A and think about drug B and think which of these two drugs is more toxic, which is the more dangerous of the two drugs to use. So again, which drug is more toxic? And the answer here is that drug B is more toxic because it means, and the reason we can know that is at any given dose, a higher percentage of users will die from the use of B than they will from the use of A. So to represent that, I've drawn a dotted line at about the midpoint on the x-axis in each of these two graphs, and you can see for drug A, at a given dose, whatever that is, 50 milligrams, let's say, a high percentage of people for drug A are getting the desired effect, and a relatively low percentage of people are dying, which that's good, right? At the same point for drug B, again, let's imagine it's 50 milligrams, about the same percentage of people are getting the desired effect. The blue lines in each graph are about the same height, but you can see in the case of drug B, the red line is shifted close such that at that same dose, 50 milligrams or whatever it is, a relatively higher percentage of people for drug B are dying. The point at which that dotted line crosses the red curve for drug B is higher than the point at which it crosses the red curve for drug A. So whether you think about it in terms of the relative heights of those lines, or you think about it in terms of how relatively close or how far those curves are, hopefully you can get a sense of how we can use these dose response curves or dose effect curves to think about toxicity when we're doing laboratory studies. Now, an important idea that deserves mentioning here, and I kind of got this a little earlier, but I'll repeat myself, is that these curves are statistical models. They are literally equations that you could mathematically write out, or you could have your computer grind out for you, and they're estimates of levels of efficacy and levels of lethality, which are typically based on animal experiments, that is, non-human animal experiments. And this, of course, is especially true when we're trying to work out the lethal dosing of a drug. It's certainly not safe by definition, and it's not ethical to deliberately give humans drugs at levels that can be lethal to them. It's something we would almost certainly try to avoid. So we often try to use animals. But of course, this is tricky to do because no model is perfect. No model is perfect, both in the sense that statistical models by their nature are typically averages. So they're not going to tell us precisely what will be true for any one person. What's the probability that this one guy who's taking 50 milligrams of the drug will be treated effectively or will die? They give us a sense of an average, and moreover, that average is extrapolated from data based on non-human animals, and whether those are mice or rats or other animal sort of analogs to humans. Differences in body size and organ system organization make it sometimes tricky to say, well, a certain amount of dosing for a mouse will be lethal, and we're going to try and multiply that out for body mass so that we can estimate what that would be like in humans. It's not perfect, but it's in many ways the best we've got, at least in terms of measuring toxicity in the laboratory. And it's important, and it's useful, and it's part of the reason why we know fairly well how to judge the toxicity of many of the medications, for instance, that we use. And that actually brings me to another important point. When we think about the medications we use, whether they're over-the-counter drugs or prescribed drugs, these are pharmaceuticals, our government regulates the manufacture and the sort of the packaging and labeling of those drugs under the auspices of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, which you've certainly heard about. Now, the FDA is empowered to regulate manufacturers of drugs by requiring them to provide data on the efficacy and the safety of their drugs. If you're a drug maker, if you're a manufacturer of medications, the FDA can approach you and say, look, you have to show us your research that you've done to demonstrate the relative efficacy and lethality of this new medication. So from time to time, you'll be reading the news, and I'm sure you'll see news articles online or in the paper about a new drug for treating cancer or a new drug for treating Alzheimer's disease. The makers of those drugs are required to do extensive research and prove to the government that the drug will be, among other things, relatively safe to use and relatively effective. That's for medications. Interestingly, that's not true for herbal supplements, and just within the last couple decades, herbal supplements have become more popular, more easily available. I can certainly remember in the 1990s, back before I went to grad school, when I started to see in places like Walmart or Target or other grocery stores, even herbal remedies packaged and put on shelves next to more conventional medications. This often gives the impression, I think, to consumers that these drugs or these herbal supplements are similarly regulated by the government, and that's actually not true. The FDA has some power to require manufacturers of herbal supplements to prove that what is in the supplement is what is labeled on the supplement, but they do not have the power to require manufacturers to prove the efficacy of their, or even the safety of their drugs. So again, if you're manufacturing an herbal supplement, you might be approached by the government, and they might say, look, your supplement says it is made of ginkgo biloba or some other herb. You have to prove to us that those little pills in that bottle really do contain that same herb that you say they contain. But you're not required to prove to us that taking that herb has any demonstrated efficacy for treating an illness or a medical condition that you're claiming, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. In fact, if you've ever bought herbal supplements, you might have looked at the label and you might have seen that in very small print, the manufacturers will often have a statement like, this drug has not, or this supplement has not been shown to be effective in treating any medical condition. Which is, it's good that they're being honest. It's probably not so good that they're putting it in tiny print on the front of their label. But again, it's because the government has relatively less power to regulate herbal supplements as compared to pharmaceuticals. And actually, this was in the news, not very recently, I think it was maybe about a year ago, where the Attorney General in the state of New York, which is actually where I used to live, mounted an investigation of several large retailers, including, I think, GNC and maybe Walmart as well, who were selling brands of different herbal supplements, containing different plant products or whatever for treatment of different illnesses. And the allegation that was being pursued was that the labeling of those supplements was not accurate, that the pills or capsules or whatever that were in the bottles did not contain very much, or in some cases any of the herbs that were being advertised on the labels. At the time this came out, there was a lot of pushback from the manufacturers of these drugs, or I should say these supplements, claiming that it's very difficult to test whether a particular pill has the particular herb that it claims to have, and that the tests that the Attorney General of New York were using were not very good tests. But at the time the news story came out, I was interested in it just because it highlighted this kind of interesting and potentially problematic reality that herbal supplements, which are very popular, and maybe you use them, there have been times in my life I've used them, are not as regulated as we might think they are. Moreover, it's interesting because I think sometimes people fall into the belief that herbal supplements are somehow safer than pharmaceutical medications because they seem natural. They're marketed often with pictures of plants or leaves or sunshine on the label, and it's easy, unless you use some critical thinking, I suppose, it's easy to imagine that these products are natural, and natural is good, and natural is healthy. Interestingly, philosophers sometimes call this the appeal to nature. It's an argument in which we claim that something is good just because it appears to be natural. So here I've got some pictures of some different herbal supplements that I found on the internet, and you can see that they're small, I suppose, but you can see that they're little pictures of plants on them, and I think there's kind of a suggestion that these things are natural, therefore they must be safe or good for you. This kind of appeal to nature argument, which says if something's natural, it must be good, and if something is unnatural, if it comes from a laboratory, it must be bad. You sometimes hear people talking about chemicals or toxins, and the implication is that these things are not natural, and therefore they must be very bad for you. The problem is it's actually difficult to know how effective or even how safe herbal supplements are, again, because the appeal to nature argument is a flawed argument. Clearly there are plenty of things which are natural which are quite dangerous for you, and some things which are unnatural, or at least synthetic, which are perfectly benign. So the argument kind of falls apart, and at least under the current kind of guidelines that the government has in place for it, the laws that empower the government to do this, the government is not required to make sure that any of these supplements are effective or even particularly safe for use. And please don't take this to mean that I'm somehow anti-herbal supplements. I mean, I don't particularly care a lot one way or the other, but I am kind of intellectually interested in them. And I do think it would probably be a good idea if there was greater oversight of this industry, because I sometimes worry that people take supplements thinking that they are effective or thinking that they're safe without having as much information as would be ideal to really make a good judgment about that. So it's hard for, in the case of laboratory studies of pharmaceuticals, as imperfect as statistical models and animal research can be, we have some idea of toxicity. In the case of studying herbal supplements, we can certainly study the efficacy and safety of these drugs, but at least the government currently isn't required, or isn't allowed, I shouldn't say isn't empowered, to require manufacturers to report this information to the government or to consumers. Of course, in the case of street drugs, we have absolutely no regulation. Drugs which are illegal, by definition, I suppose, almost have little or no government oversight. So as much as you might worry about the efficacy or safety of pharmaceuticals or herbal supplements, you might worry a lot about the efficacy or safety of street drugs, because there is no regulation. No one is checking that the manufacturers of crystal meth or MDMA, that is to say ecstasy or heroin or cocaine, are in any way ensuring the safety of those drugs. And often, of course, with street drugs, there's a high risk of adulterants, that is, things which are other than the drug mixed in to extend the amount that can be sold. So someone who's selling cocaine will cut into the cocaine powder other powders like baking soda or chalk dust or whatever, flour, things which look a lot like cocaine, and make the bulk of the volume bigger, which allows the drug dealer to sell more, cutting or stepping on, as it's sometimes called in street slang, the product. Those adulterants may themselves be quite dangerous to the body, in addition to the danger that's posed with the actual drug itself. So again, if we look at a street drug like crystal meth here, it's almost impossible to know the concentration or the contamination associated with many street drugs. And actually, I'm going to put a link online to a very interesting video which was developed by Vice Media. They're a company that hosts a website and does a lot of interesting programs, some of which have to do with drug use, where the reporters interviewed some different not-for-profit groups that go around helping people to do testing on the street drugs they purchase, so as to understand how concentrated or how adulterated are the drugs that you've bought at that concert you went to, or from that drug dealer who you know. Another important idea, and I actually will provide a link to this online as well, is that this extends to drugs, illegal drugs or street drugs, not just things like crystal meth or cocaine, which are obviously quite processed or manufactured, but even drugs like marijuana. There was a news story on NPR just this last week talking about the manufacture of marijuana and how there's essentially little or no regulation for the type of agricultural products which can be applied to to marijuana crops. So if you're growing marijuana, maybe you want to sell it illegally, or maybe you want to sell it legally or semi-legally in a medicalized form. There's very little government oversight as to the type of herbicides or pesticides or fungicides or fertilizers that you put on that crop. Now, people worry about things like, should I buy organic produce when I go to the grocery store? Should I buy produce that is not made of genetically modified plants? Those are concerns people have about the food that they eat, but sometimes when folks use marijuana, and I'm not anti-marijuana, to be honest, sometimes when people use marijuana, they say, oh, it's natural, it's an herb, it grows in the ground. Yes, it does, but some of the people, in fact, most of the people who grow marijuana, apply a lot of chemicals to it to help it to grow and to discourage it from being preyed upon by parasites or fungi, etc. And some of those chemicals can be quite dangerous to the human body, and the government does very little, can do very little to regulate it at this point. That's changing actually in states like Minnesota and other states which are developing medical marijuana laws, because part of the thing that those states have to do now is develop ways that the government can regulate, what types of fertilizers can you use when you're growing marijuana, such that the marijuana, when it's processed to be smoked or consumed, will be safe for the human body. So it's an interesting and evolving issue, again, that has to do, at least for the purpose of our lecture, with understanding toxicity. And that's just one way to think about the risks associated with using drugs. An important idea, and I will provide a link to that video very soon. Another thing to think about, and this is kind of maybe a philosophical or maybe even a political point, is that some drugs are illegal because they're dangerous, or at least we as a society judge them to be dangerous. Cocaine, heroin, crystal meth, an example. And to be clear, there are other ways to think about dangerousness other than just toxicity. But some drugs are illegal because they're dangerous, and some drugs are dangerous because they're illegal. Making a drug illegal can make the drug more dangerous because it puts that drug into a world, a kind of an underworld, in which there's little or no government regulation of its dosage, its manufacturing, or its sale, or its dosage. You could imagine a different world in which drugs were legal but heavily regulated by the government. You could imagine that it might be legal to purchase cocaine, but manufacturers of cocaine are required to ensure that it's manufactured in a way that is pure and does not contain toxic additives, or they can only sell it in doses which are not likely to be lethal to people. Or you can imagine, as is happening with marijuana now, is if marijuana becomes legal or semi-legal, the government can try to ensure that pesticides which are toxic to the human body are not applied to crops of marijuana. I think about this in terms of the unintended consequences of regulation. Or especially the unintended consequences of illegality. If we prohibit a drug, we do that, society does that often with an eye towards increasing safety by keeping away dangerous drugs from people, especially young people. That's an understandable desire. But sometimes the very act of making something illegal and prohibiting it can increase the risk associated with use. Those of you who are students of history, or indeed all of you when we get to this lecture on alcohol, will remember that during Prohibition in the 1920s in America, when alcohol was made for most purposes illegal, there were a lot of the push behind that was to increase safety, because there were lots of health problems, and there still are, associated with alcohol use. But it led to increased dangerousness of alcohol, because illegal alcohol made during that period was often made in ways that was dangerous or included adulterants, had poor purity that could lead to damage to the health of people who did choose to illegally use alcohol. So it's an old story, but it's also a new story. And it's one of the challenges that comes up when we think about how to judge the riskiness or the dangerousness of drugs, especially when we're focusing on the idea of toxicity, dangerousness to the human body. Okay, so just to step back and review for a moment, recall that we're focusing on toxicity as a way of thinking about dangerousness or riskiness of drug use, and I've told you there are two ways for measuring toxicity. One is experimental, where we're doing lab studies, often involving animals, sometimes involving people, and we're trying to plot out effective dosing and lethal dosing curves and try to understand the margin of safety for a given drug. Another approach is the non-experimental approach, where we go out to the real world. We look at hospitals or clinics or police stations, prisons, etc., places where people who have drug use will sometimes end up, especially if they're having trouble, and we try to understand what type of drugs lead people to end up in the emergency room or lead people to end up, in the morgue, dead from an overdose. When we're doing this, there are different data sources we use. I'm going to highlight one of them right now. It's called the Drug Abuse Warning Network, or DAWN. DAWN is a voluntary network of hospitals that participate in a data sharing program where the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is part of the government, gathers reports of the number of drug-related emergency room, or ER, visits from different hospitals in major metropolitan areas around the country. It's not a perfect sampling of the entire population of America, but it highlights some of the different drugs which lead people to get into problems in different places in the country. What drugs lead you to end up in the emergency room? What drugs will lead you to end up in the hospital? Now, DAWN focuses on illicit drugs. It also focuses a little bit on licit drugs, including prescription drugs and over-the-counter medications. So if you're a hospital, you're the administrator of a hospital, and you're participating in the DAWN system, you will gather just counts every month of the number of people who ended up in the ER because they were using illegal drugs. Also counts of the number of people who ended up in the ER because they were misusing prescription or over-the-counter drugs. Alcohol is a little tricky though, because the DAWN system currently only counts alcohol visits if the people in the ER are underage. So if an underage drinker comes in because he's got alcohol poisoning, then it will be recorded. If someone who's overage comes in, it may not be, unless the alcohol use is in combination with other drugs. So it's kind of an odd system in that it records illegal drugs, legal drugs other than alcohol. Alcohol is kind of poorly measured, in my judgment and the judgment of other people, by this system. Nonetheless, it's a useful system, and it gives us a sense of, at least in a non-experimental sense, of the relative toxicity of different groups of drugs. So here is a graph that you can see from just a summary of some of the data from the DAWN network from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. I'll link to them on the website so you can kind of follow along if you're curious about this. You can just see over time the numbers of ER, or ED, it's emergency department, equivalent to an ER of course, associated with adverse reactions to different medications. So that is, you're using a drug and you had an unexpectedly adverse reaction to it. You can see that's in red. You can see in the gray line that's misuse or abuse of pharmaceuticals. As I said, I think in my last lecture, there's been kind of a general trend over the last couple decades of people misusing prescription drugs, especially painkillers like opioid analgesics, or also anxiolytic drugs, so anti-anxiety drugs. That's been leading to increased rates of, or an increasing rate of drug problems, including, as you can see here, emergency department visits. You can also see here on the blue line a kind of a steady level of emergency department visits related to illegal drugs. So this is kind of just a pictographic representation of some of the data from DAWN up through relatively recent years. Here is a part of a table from the website. I know this is small print, so depending on the size of the device you're watching this video on, you may have to really squint to see it. But what it highlights, you can check this yourself on the website, which I'll link to, is that most misuse-related visits, that is, most emergency department visits that are related to misuse of medications, are specifically around misuse of anti-anxiety drugs and analgesic drugs. So just as I kind of said before, lots of people can misuse or even deliberately abuse medications and have problems that lead them to go to the hospital, to go to the emergency room. But if we look at the drugs which are causing the greatest amount of those visits, they're in most years the anti-anxiety drugs and the painkillers or the analgesics. Here's another part of that same table. I cut it and put it on a separate slide here. Again, I apologize for the small text. If we look at the emergency room or emergency department visits related to illicit drugs, that is, drugs which are illegal for folks, the most visits are associated with cocaine use and with marijuana use. Not all of these, I should say, are lethal visits. These are not all people who died. These are just merely people who went to the emergency room for any sort of reason because they were using drugs. Which are the drugs which get people into the hospital the most? A question you might ask is, well, what about alcohol? As I said before, the DAWN system doesn't, in my judgment and the judgment of other people, you do a very good job at capturing alcohol visits. Alcohol accounts for far more emergency room or emergency department visits than all other drugs, but it's not counted by itself unless you're underage. So if we did count all the people who ended up in the emergency room for alcohol use, even just alcohol, they weren't using other drugs as well, and we included people who were over age who could legally use alcohol, we would find that that number, the number associated with all those emergency room alcohol visits, would be much larger than the number for all the other drugs. So again, we only count alcohol for underage people or when people are drinking alcohol but also using other drugs. And interestingly, the drugs that people tend to use the most with alcohol are cocaine and marijuana, which may actually have something to do with why cocaine and marijuana top the list of emergency room visits for illicit drugs, as you hopefully remember from the previous slide. Just a little sidebar here. This idea of using multiple drugs at the same time, you're probably familiar with it. There certainly have been, I even talked about this in a previous lecture, examples of deaths of famous people, celebrities. They've been associated with misusing multiple drugs at the same time. This is technically, or at least sometimes called, polysubstance abuse. It's just merely using more than one drug at the same time. So for example, using alcohol and marijuana at the same time. We'll talk about this in future lectures, but for now, suffice it to say that polysubstance abuse is often very dangerous. And it's dangerous because we can sometimes see synergistic interactions between the chemicals in two different drugs. And those synergistic interactions can compress the margin of safety for a particular drug. So a good example of this, and actually I'm not talking about in this lecture, but I will in a future lecture, is the combination of cocaine and alcohol. If you take cocaine by itself, it will tend to increase your heart rate, even so much so as to be dangerous. There are examples of people who will suffer from heart attack or other cardiovascular problems if they use just cocaine. A lot of times people who use cocaine also like to drink alcohol because it kind of mellows them out. At least subjectively they'll describe it kind of takes the edge off the cocaine high. The problem is when you combine alcohol and cocaine together, it really can jack up your heart rate such that the dangerousness to your heart of cocaine is actually much greater if you're also drinking alcohol at the same time. So that margin of safety, if you can see here, the full blue line would be the lethal dosing curve for a drug. If there's a synergistic interaction, say if you're taking cocaine but also drinking alcohol, unbeknownst to you, that lethal dose curve is sliding to the left, getting closer to that effective dose curve, which isn't pictured here, increasing the chances that for you, or at least on average for a group of people, there'll be lethal or at least severely toxic effects. So again, synergistic interactions can occur. They don't always occur, but they can occur when we take more than one drug at the same time. If you've ever, and hopefully you have, if you've ever taken sleep medication and you've looked on the side of the bottle of pills, it might say something like don't take these pills if you're consuming alcohol. Another common example is acetaminophen. That's the active ingredient in Tylenol. It can be quite toxic if you're also drinking alcohol. So sometimes people take Tylenol because they have a headache, because they're hungover from drinking too much. That can be really dangerous, because if you have alcohol kicking around in your system, you can get a fairly severe toxic interaction from the acetaminophen and the alcohol, which can damage your liver. So there are plenty of examples of this. As someone who has studied alcohol in terms of my research, I remember once thinking, alcohol can be a great drug. It can be good if you enjoy it responsibly, but it is a drug that, if you combine it with other drugs, almost always makes things worse. So not to turn this into a lecture where I give you a lot of health advice, but please, if you're using other drugs, be very careful about using alcohol. Alcohol rarely makes other drugs better, or certainly rarely makes them safer to use. So that's alcohol. An important idea here is that the way the DAWN system counts alcohol makes it very difficult to judge toxicity. I mean, hopefully you've seen that already. It's an imperfect system for judging the toxicity of alcohol. I think if it was a more representative counting system, it would probably reveal that alcohol is quite a dangerous drug in terms of its toxicity, at least as measured in the field, because many people, sadly, who drink too much alcohol can get into all sorts of problems that can lead them to go to the emergency department of a hospital or a clinic. Another important idea actually has to do with marijuana, and you'll recall a few slides back that, at least according to the counts that are submitted to the DAWN system, it sort of looks like marijuana is one of the most toxic drugs out there, right up there with cocaine, because there are a lot of visits that are associated, emergency room visits that is, they're associated with using marijuana. That could lead you to think that marijuana is quite toxic. There's probably some value to that conclusion, but it's important to think about, or to note, that just knowing the number of emergency room visits associated with a drug, in this case marijuana, isn't enough. What we really want to know is how big that number is as a percentage of the overall population of users. So, let's imagine that in a given year, 1,000 people end up in a hospital because of marijuana. That's, depending on how big the area is that we're considering, that may be a very small number, but just to keep it simple, we'd say 1,000 people in a year ended up in the hospital because of marijuana. Or what we really want to know is that 1,000 people a large fraction or a small fraction of the overall people in that population who use marijuana? Because clearly, if it's a large fraction, there are only 1,001 people in the community who use marijuana, and 1,000 of them ended up in the hospital, then wow, marijuana would look incredibly toxic. But if in that community sort of 100,000 people used marijuana, gosh, these numbers are weird, I'm just pulling them out of the air. If 100,000 people in the community used marijuana, but only 1,000 people ended up in the hospital, then of course marijuana looks a lot less toxic. Well, that's true for any drug, really, but it's the example of marijuana, I think, is important, because you will sometimes see it proclaimed, especially on government websites, that marijuana is a very toxic drug, and as evidence for this conclusion, data from the DAWN data set will be cited. Clearly marijuana is toxic because look at how many people end up in the hospital because of marijuana. And not to trivialize that, I mean, anyone who ends up in the hospital for any drug, that's serious, and my heart goes out to them. But if you actually look at the data in terms of the population of people who use marijuana and the fraction of that population who end up going to hospital because the conclusion you get is a little bit different. This is actually from a story that ran in the Washington Post last year, I think. Again, I'll link to it online. What the author of the article did was he tried to describe that fraction, or those fractions. What fraction of users of a drug end up in the hospital because of it. And by comparing those two numbers, like what's the overall population of heroin users, what's the overall population of cocaine users, what is the overall population of marijuana users, and then within those populations, what percentage or what fraction of folks end up in the hospital, the author constructed these graphs. And you can see here that, relatively speaking, when you look at it this way, marijuana is not particularly toxic, because it's a relatively popular drug. At least among the illegal drugs, it's the most popular illegal drug. And And of the population of people who use it, a relatively small fraction of people end up going to the hospitals and having problems and going to hospitals, at least the hospitals that are part of the Dawn network. And the number is less than, although I don't think statistically significantly different from, the population of people who end up going to the hospital because of alcohol. So again, earlier on I said that alcohol is associated with a lot of problems. It absolutely is. But alcohol is a tremendously popular drug, and thankfully most of the people who use alcohol don't end up going to the emergency room. Compare that to heroin. Heroin is not a very popular drug. It's the population of people who use heroin regularly is very small, thankfully. But within that population, a lot of the people who use heroin end up going to the hospital at one point or another. So comparatively speaking, it's a tremendously toxic drug. Anyway, complicated stuff to think about. To simplify things, what we could say, the relative population of users. When we think relative to the population of users, there are some drugs which are associated with more emergencies or more emergency room visits. Drugs like heroin and cocaine and methamphetamine. Again, relatively small total populations of users. Not that many people use methamphetamine, for instance, but within that population, a fairly large number of people end up having medical problems and going to the hospital. There's some drugs that are associated with relatively fewer emergencies. A lot of people use marijuana. A lot of people use use alcohol, but a relatively small fraction of those folks end up going to the hospital because of it. And to be clear, the people who do go to the hospital, gosh, that's bad. And it's not to say that those drugs are harmless. They can cause a lot of harm. Also, I have a note here that alcohol is more dangerous than marijuana. That's a somewhat controversial point. I mean, I'm honestly not sure if the relative toxicity, at least measured this way, is significantly different between the two. As you saw on the graph in the previous slide, it's pretty close. Maybe it might be the case that alcohol is actually a little bit more dangerous than marijuana if we think about the population of people who use the drug, and then within that population, what fraction end up in the emergency room. And by the way, as a side point, remember, this is just one way of thinking about toxicity. You could also say, well, in laboratory studies, can we give doses of alcohol that will kill laboratory animals like rats and mice? We absolutely can. People can die from overdosing on alcohol. It's relatively difficult. It's probably almost impossible to overdose and kill a rat, let's say, on marijuana, and there really are essentially no recorded human deaths associated with just using marijuana. So if we think about toxicity in that way, we again get this impression that alcohol is probably more dangerous than marijuana in that respect. More just important points is that the Dawn system is telling us about toxicity in terms of a number of problems, especially ER visits and actually deaths. So again, who shows up at the hospital either alive or dead because of drug use. It doesn't tell us in terms of toxicity in terms of the total number of problems versus the population of users. And I guess I've kind of said that a few times already, but just to indulge me in this repetition. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, they top the list of visits and deaths, even though they're relatively rarely used, thankfully. Marijuana, as an example, lower on the list for visits, ER visits and deaths, even though it's a relatively more common drug to use. And alcohol, at least measured alone, is just not accurately captured in the Dawn data. It's tricky to measure because we don't have good counts of the number of people who end up in the hospital just because of alcohol, who weren't using other drugs or who were not underage. So again, we're different ways of measuring toxicity, laboratory ways, non-laboratory ways. I'm going to provide some links on the Blackboard website to some interesting resources where you can follow up on this. An important point that I wanted to make here, an important idea I wanted to make here, is that the Dawn data set really tells us about short-term risk. That is, what number of people end up in the hospital or end up dead more or less right after using a drug. You might ask, well, what about long-term risk? What about the dangers associated with drug use that may not show up for months or even years down the line? And here's where I'll pause and say, before going on or before looking ahead in your notes, what drugs do you think are associated with the greatest danger in terms of both short-term use and in terms of long-term use? Like if I had to ask you, how dangerous is, what do you think are the most dangerous drugs in terms of long-term use? What would you say? Well, as you ponder this question, what you're really thinking about are these ideas that I mentioned a little bit earlier: acute toxicity and chronic toxicity. So there are drugs which are clearly have a high level of acute toxicity. So heroin's a good example of that, especially if it's injected, as you can see in this image here. So whether we measure the acute toxicity of heroin in the laboratory by constructing a dose-response curve for effective dose and lethal dose using animal models, or whether we measure it in a non-experimental way out in the field by counting the number of people who end up in the emergency room because of heroin, either way, the acute toxicity of heroin is pretty high. You can fairly easily kill yourself with heroin in the short term. In the long term, there are drugs which you might not expect, which are associated with relatively high levels of chronic toxicity. And the best example of this, of course, is nicotine in the form of tobacco smoking, cigarettes especially. So tobacco, if you've ever smoked, I used to smoke when I was in college a little bit, and then later on when I was in grad school. If you ever smoke a cigarette, it may make you feel a bit sick the first time you smoke it, but if you're a relatively healthy person, it's unlikely that you will die immediately from smoking a cigarette. Although interestingly, the level of nicotine in a cigarette, if you could get all of it in your body at once, would probably kill you. But most of it doesn't get into your body even when you smoke. So the acute toxicity of nicotine, at least the amounts that you get it when you smoke a cigarette, relatively low. But the chronic toxicity associated with smoking is relatively high. So if we look at the total number of deaths associated with illegal drugs over the long term, that is, if we try to look at data on just mortality, what kills people in America over a period of time, we see a fair number of people. I'm actually not sure what the timeline is here, but I merely put this graph up here to give you a sense of the relative sizes of these numbers of deaths. Within any given time period, a certain number of people will die from illegal drugs. They'll overdose on illegal drugs. There's a certain number of people who will die from use of alcohol, and a relatively large number of people who will die over time because they use tobacco. And to be interesting point here, it's not so much the nicotine and the tobacco that's dangerous to you, although it does have some adverse cardiovascular effects. It's more the risk associated with the smoke of cigarettes, which have all sorts of carcinogens, as you almost certainly know. So we've talked a lot, or I've talked a lot in this lecture about toxicity, which again is just one way to think about the dangerousness or the riskiness of drug use. As a preview for the next lecture, I'm going to keep talking about this problem. Are drugs a problem, or maybe more accurately, is drug use a problem? How can we decide? How can we think about risk? But next time I'm going to focus on addiction, dependence, and see to what extent can we understand the relative likelihood of becoming addicted to a drug, and does that in any way inform our judgment of how risky a drug is as compared to another drug? So thanks for sticking with me. By the little clock on my laptop, I can see I've been talking for just over an hour. That's a long time for me. It's probably a long time for you too. I hope you have a chance to take a break, kick back and relax, have a cup of coffee or tea if you're feeling sleepy as I am. And I will catch you in the next lecture. I'll also post a lot of resources associated with this lecture online very, very soon. Thanks so much. As I always say, thank you for your attention. Bye-bye, guys.